So good afternoon, everyone. Today, this training is mainly geared to trying to help you all understand the difference between native plants, ornamental grass versus high grass and weeds.
Erica, excuse me, Erica. I
Yes.
can't hear you.
Can't hear me? Can anybody else hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, you coming through fine on this side.
Okay, Adam, I think it's just you.
No, somebody else can hear you also.
Okay. She says she can't hear. I don't know.
Yeah, there are actually 3 people in the chat saying they can't hear.
Yeah. Turn on.
This says turn on the audio. It's a good tip.
I can't hear you. I can't see you.
Can't see me?
Yep, I can hear you, but I can't see you. So let me see what I'm doing wrong. Wait a minute. I guess I'm okay long as I can hear you, right?
You'll need to see for the presentation.
Okay, let me try to figure out what's going on. Okay.
I can say something again.
Testing, testing.
Gotcha.
Good. Anybody else still having problems hearing?
Okay, I guess I can see now.
Okay, can everyone see me and hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. So again, just want to say good afternoon to everyone. This training is just to give you all a clear understanding of what native plants, ornamental grasses versus high grass and weeds. Now that we are entering our season where the flowers are growing, grass is growing, just wanted you all to understand how and what the plants look like throughout the seasons, off season, during peak season, and just so that it'll be easier for you to identify. I've gotten a lot of complaints from constituents saying that, hey, these are plants, these are not high grass and weeds. I received a citation or I received a violation notice. So just to try to eliminate some of those concerns through the Environmental Control Board as well, I just wanted to give you all the opportunity just to understand, how it looked, why it looked this way, and how can we prevent a citation going out and then being voided, because every void that we receive or we have to put in is tabulated at the end of the year. So if you all have any questions, definitely put it in the chat box, but this is an interactive training. So you do have the opportunity to talk and interact with Aaron and Susie throughout the training. I believe they're going to have breakout rooms for interaction. So with all due, I'll let Aaron and Susie go ahead on with the presentation.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Let's see. All right. Thanks everybody for having us today. I know it's a beautiful day, and it's usually on days like this that I think, oh, I have to sit in front of a Zoom meeting. So I wish that we could be in person together and have a really good discussion. So we're going to try to replicate an in-person training as best we can. And one of the things that's going to make that really helpful and more interactive for all of us is if you're able to be on your camera so that we can see each other. I would appreciate that, especially once we get into our smaller breakout rooms towards the end of the training. It's actually going to be a challenge where we'll have teams competing against each other. And so the more people we can get engaging and interacting and giving your thoughts and opinions, the better that your team will do. So I'll look forward to that toward the end. Anytime throughout our training, if you have questions or thoughts or concerns, you can put those into the chat. I might not be looking at them right away, but I'm here with my colleague, Susie Creamer, and she will be able to address those or stop me if we need to pause and address something. Other than that, Superintendent Yates has let me know that if you need to speak, you can use the raise hand feature that's in the participants list. Or, you know, this a small enough group, you can just kind of like pipe up and we'll get to your concerns. So with that, let me move on to our presentation. So some brief introductions, just so that we all know how we got here, why we're here today, before we start to break down the code. And I'm not going to belabor the point about what the code is. That is your expertise. That is not my expertise. But I think it's important to start there before we dive into this thing called conservation landscaping, and then see how all of that looks in the real world. You know, we want this to be as applicable as possible in your, you know, day-to-day experience. So again, if anything is kind of like not sitting right with you, or you're thinking that's not my experience, just definitely put those things into the chat, and then we can have a good discussion. So I welcome that. So just to kind of go back to where this all started, we actually submitted a proposal to form this partnership back in 2019, which kind of seems like a different world back then to a lot of us. So this proposal brought together ourselves at Patterson Park Audubon Center, along with you all at the Department of Housing and the Baltimore Office of Sustainability. And so we're trying to find the places where, like Superintendent Yates said, kind of like where do our goals overlap? How can we impart some knowledge to raise awareness both on your side, on the side of the inspectors and the lawyers who deal with these issues, as well as on, you know, the residents, the homeowners side. So our goal here is really to try to distinguish between cultivated wildflower gardens and neglected overgrown spaces, right? Just like Superintendent Yates said. There are lots of ways that that distinction can get muddled. So we're gonna try to go through some specific species, look at lots of photos. I want this to be very visual, and hopefully I'll hear from you a little bit more about what your experience is like. So just to let you know who we are. So Patterson Park Audubon Center was established in the Patterson Park neighborhood of Baltimore in 2002, but we are part of a much larger organization called National Audubon Society, whose main focus is to restore ecosystems, focusing on birds and their habitats. But while we are here for birds, we are also here for beautiful, clean neighborhoods, which of course people need too. Oop. Okay, so we do that through lots of different kinds of programs. During normal times, we have lots of school kids walking with their classes to meet us in Patterson Park and get some hands-on science, learning happening. We also have volunteer groups and free bird watching tours, both in Patterson Park and in Druid Hill Park. And of course, lots of greening projects. We do that with students and neighbors, any group who wants to make their neighborhood more beautiful while making it more friendly for birds and wildlife at the same time. So that image in the top center is actually our middle school green leaders. These are students who are learning about climate change and advocacy, and they led a planting project at their school. So if you want to know any more about the programs that we do at Patterson Park Audubon Center, you can go on our website, which is patterson.audubon.org. And we also have a Facebook page, an Instagram page, YouTube. So feel free to follow us on all the things. So, more to the point of why we're here today is this program. So in 2013, we launched a bird-friendly habitat recognition program in Baltimore. And this program was modeled after many existing programs throughout the Audubon network across the country. So, we started giving workshops, both open to the public and for private gardening groups and other groups, trying to encourage and coach people on how to basically share their spaces, no matter where they are, what size, what shape, share those spaces with birds and other biodiversity, other kinds of wildlife. And I can illustrate a little bit more later what that means, like what it means to be a bird-friendly habitat. But suffice to say, it's a little more wild of an aesthetic than probably folks are used to, right? So, we recognize that the landscape we're promoting doesn't exactly fit into sort of the traditional American yard of manicured lawn and tidy shrubs in perfect spheres and cubes. We're really less about that, although we do want these places to be beautiful and welcoming for people as well as wildlife. But there's definitely a different kind of aesthetic to it. And so we realize that that doesn't always suit everyone. So, nevertheless, we were able to get a lot of folks applying to get their Audubon signs in their gardens in Baltimore. And by 2015, we were able to expand this program across the state with the help of Audubon volunteer chapters. And that means that people from anywhere in the state of Maryland or DC can send in their application to us, telling us how many kinds of native plants they have and how they're reducing threats to birds. And then we send them their Audubon sign and we're able to track it on a map such as this. So, it's a really cool program that I have a lot of passion about. Definitely feel free to ask me any more questions about, what it means to apply for and get your sign. But it's my hope that folks will see these start popping up across the city and across the state, and that they can serve as, a launching point for conversations about, why to do this and what does this mean to share our gardens with birds. Like I mentioned, when it comes to the actual, code about high grass and weeds, I am not here to tell any of you how to do your job, especially folks who've been here for 20 and 30 years. You are the experts on the code. I had to look it up and study it. I had never thought about it or actually read the code before. But I think it's an important place for us to start. We don't need to read this whole thing, but I do want to call out some important terms that we're going to think some more about. So, when I first started reading the code, the first word that kind of made me pause is this word weeds. And that's because the word weed is not a scientific word at all. There's no definition of, this plant species is a weed and this plant species is not a weed. A weed is totally in the eye of the beholder. I might plant something that you might consider is a weed. You might plant something that I might consider to be a weed. The actual definition of the word weed is just a wild plant that's growing where it's not wanted, and it's in competition with cultivated plants. Okay, so it's growing where it wasn't planted, it's growing where it's not wanted, it wasn't planted there, and it's competing with the things that were planted and you do want growing there. So that brings us to this word cultivated. And this is really where we want to dig in, how to tell the difference between weeds and cultivated plants. Cultivated just means it's purposefully planted, okay? So, sometimes I'm sure it's really easy to tell when a space is neglected, regardless of whether you are an expert on the species of plants that are growing there. There are other signals, and I'm sure you can think of some of them, things like trash or rat holes, or maybe the building next to this yard also looks like it's, in ill repair. So things like that. But sometimes it's not easy to tell. Sometimes the resident is purposefully cultivating plants that look weedy. Okay, so they're planting things on purpose, but they don't really fit into the aesthetic that I talked about earlier, that kind of like closely manicured lawn, things like that. So in that case, the plants aren't weeds, they're being cultivated on purpose. But sometimes residents do this right, and sometimes they don't do it right. And that's where, it can get a little bit tricky. And when I say they don't do it right, I mean either, they're breaking the code because the plants are too close to the sidewalk, they're kind of obstructing the walkway, things like that. Or they might not be doing it right because they don't have the knowledge to know, like, what does it mean to plant like a habitat garden? So we'll get into that in a little bit. So for now, I wanted to hear a little more from you in the chat about, what are your biggest challenges when you're working in the field when it comes to, this issue of weeds versus cultivated flowers, or maybe other issues if you have them. So what is it that makes your job really hard? That's something that I want you to put into the chat. I want to hear about, some of the issues that you experience when you're working in the field on a day-to-day basis. And we don't have to kind of like dive into them. I'm certainly not going to sit and solve each of them today, but it'll start to sort of get our wheels turning about what some of the solutions to those challenges might be, and what kinds of resources you might need to help solve those problems. So don't everyone dive in all at once, but what are some of the challenges, your biggest challenges that you face when working in the field? I'm just going to let that question sit there for a minute, and then we'll keep going. All right, so I see some answers coming in, so thank you. Again, if if you need some clarification on that question, let me know, but I'm just wondering, what are your biggest challenges when working in the field? Specifically when it comes to this issues of like what are weeds or tall grass? What is it about your job that is really hard? I realize some of you are maybe on your phones, and so it might be difficult to type things into the chat. So I recognize that. That's okay. Okay. So if you think of any other challenges, go ahead and put them into the chat. But, I want to be able to start thinking about, what are some things that, are challenging about this issue? And then we can, think about some of the solutions. And that might be, some kind of resource to give to you, or it also might be some kind of intervention on the part of the resident. Remember, I said this is kind of like a two-pronged approach. We want to be able to increase awareness on both sides of the violation. Okay, interesting. So sometimes there's a property that appears overgrown, but it's not actually encroaching the public right of way. Okay, so in that case, you are having to decide, you are having to determine if that property is, are the plants being cultivated? Are they purposefully planted there, or are they overgrown weeds? Yes, thanks so much, folks, for putting some things in the chat. Okay, so an unkept garden can be a hazard and a nuisance to neighbors. Okay, so yeah, definitely when, there are places in Baltimore City where homeowners associations exist, but most places do not. So in theory, I could plant whatever I want in my yard, regardless of how my neighbors feel about it, as long as it's not encroaching on the right of way. So that can be an issue. If my neighbors don't kind of share my aesthetic, they might not feel so great about that. All right, feel free to keep putting your thoughts into the chat. I'm going to give a background to this thing called conservation landscaping. So conservation landscaping is really what we at Audubon are trying to promote. And I will list all of the very many benefits of conservation landscaping, but just to start, so conservation landscaping is something that is also called wildscaping, or here in the Chesapeake Bay region, you might also hear it called bayscaping. We call it bird-friendly gardening. We call it habitat gardening. Basically, all of these things mean the same thing, which is that we are landscaping in a way that balances and hopefully maximizes both sides of this seesaw that you see. So on the left side of the seesaw are aesthetics, how things look, and all the kind of like human dominated reasons to plant plants in your garden. So that largest circle on the entire page is decorative value. It's ornamental. It makes our outdoor spaces look pretty, curb appeal, right? On the right side of the seesaw are all of the ecological services, all right? And these are the things that folks sometimes don't even think about when they are, managing their landscapes. So what does my landscape, what does my garden mean for the larger food web? What does my garden mean for its value to the watershed? All of these things are combined are what we're trying to do with conservation landscaping. And the reason it's a seesaw is because, most of the time when people garden, the seesaw is heavily weighed down on the decorative value side. And we're not trying to like heavily weigh it down on the other side either. We're trying to find a balance. So I mentioned lots of benefits. We don't have to go through all of these, but conservation landscaping, of course, is really great for the environment because all of these plants are improving our air and water quality. They're soaking up and cleaning our air and water. Having a density of plants like this helps to prevent erosion and maintains healthy soils. We're trying to prevent invasive plant outbreaks and diseases, and maintain a healthy web of life, which brings us to all of the human benefits. So these types of gardens have a lot less maintenance involved over time with them. So you're not worrying so much about mowing the grass and all of the energy involved in that, or leaf blowing, things like that. So we're reducing waste. We're also reducing flooding. So that's a huge human impact right there. And that is certainly something that has impacted parts of our city. We're also, cooling our city down, all of these things, right? So there's environmental benefits, there's human benefits, there's a lot of overlap there. And then specifically for our birds, we want our cities to be urban oases as opposed to a death trap. You might be surprised about how many birds find their ways into cities. They're drawn by the lights. And so we want to encourage this kind of patchwork quilt of habitat where birds can stop over as they're migrating and not, fall victim to this sort of like urban glass jungle where they're not able to make it along their migratory journeys. So, what does conservation landscaping actually look like? It's really a combination of these four things. The first one is native plant species. So these are plant species which co-evolved with our local flora and fauna, and that means that they support our local food web. That's the reason that makes them so important, because they're feeding things like insects, which are feeding birds and the rest of the food web. Second, conservation landscaping a lot of times has, or it's the goal at least, to have less lawn and less impervious surfaces. So that means more densely planted vegetation than in more traditional plantings of flowers and shrubs and trees that are surrounded by mulch. Okay, we're trying to reduce the amount of runoff. So when water hits like an impervious surface like a patio or even like a lawn of grass, water is going to run off of that much more easily than when there are taller plants that are planted more closely together. So we're trying to encourage people to have less lawn and less impervious surfaces, more dense vegetation. It also means planting plants in layers from the ground cover at the ground all the way up to the canopy. And this provides niches for animals to occupy throughout, those different layers. So there are some species of animals that only live in certain layers of the habitat. Think about, hawks and owls and things need to perch way high up in the canopy so that they can look down for their prey, where things like robins, you almost always see them on the ground. They're ground foragers. They're kind of hopping around and looking for worms. So by planting more layers in a garden, that means that we are increasing the amount of biodiversity that can live there. And then finally, we're thinking about conservation-minded maintenance. So that's things like leaving dead stems to harbor overwintering insects, so not cutting those back in the fall, leaving them standing throughout the winter, as well as those seed heads. So when flower heads go to seed, we actually encourage people to leave those seed heads there so that birds can eat the seeds throughout the winter. And also not disposing of leaves in the fall, which can hide insects like baby moths and caterpillars, which then birds will feed to their babies in the spring. So again, I realize not a lot of this is very traditional. You know, we're used to keeping our gardens really tidy, right? We want to sweep up all the leaves and get rid of them. And then in the spring, we put down mulch. And so we try to, you know, coach people on the fact that, you know, if we leave those leaves there, if we kind of push them into your flower beds, then you don't need to mulch in the spring. That is nature's mulch. So there's, you know, a lot of like long-term and seasonal maintenance to keep in mind when it comes to conservation landscaping as well. So in terms of, you know, making a distinction between, you know, what is conservation landscaping, what are we trying to encourage people to do when it comes to like planting all of these tall plants, and what is it not? And, you know, the reason that I bring this up is because of, you know, way back at the beginning when I said, you know, some residents plant things that look weedy, and some of them are doing it the right way and some of them are not. So this, you know, these are things that folks might think looks similar, has kind of like a similar aesthetic, but this is actually not conservation landscaping. So things like invasive non-native species, like this overgrown area, and overgrown lawn. So, you know, even if the lawn is scattered with quote unquote wildflower seeds, most times these are not native and therefore they are not supporting the food web. So that's not something that we would encourage people to do. So really what we mean is that we do not want people to pull an Elsa. And so I'm going to ask you if you know her song line from the first Frozen movie. I want someone to turn off their microphone and tell us how it goes. What does Elsa say in her song? Superintendent Yates did a beautiful rendition when we did a practice run of this. We know what she says. What does Elsa say? Really? No one knows?
Someone typed it in the chat, but I think they're not clear that you want to hear them sing it.
I want to hear someone sing it. How does it go?
She doesn't have a mic. Oh, man.
Okay, am I going to have to do it? Let it go, let it go. Okay, so we're not telling people to pull an Elsa. We don't want people to just let their yard go and let nature take over. That is not conservation landscaping, okay? That is just overgrown lawn and weeds probably. So I recognize, I believe both of these images are code violations because of the height of the vegetation that's right next to the sidewalk. But, you know, putting that aside briefly, can we tell at least which one is cultivated? Which one looks like conservation landscaping, has native plants, layers, and which one is just overgrown lawn? Either left or right, you can type it into the chat. Which one is cultivated, left or right? Which one is overgrown lawn, left or right? I think it's probably a pretty easy distinction in this case. Left, cultivated, right, a $50 citation. Oh man, okay. I think technically both of them are a citation, but okay, yes. So right is not conservation landscaping. That's just someone letting it go. They're pulling an Elsa. That's not what we're here to promote. On the left, somebody planted those plants, okay? And I can see specific species of native perennials in that image, which is what we're actually going to get to next. So, I know that we're here, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of kind of pieces to this. Is it against the code or is it not against the code? Is it a violation or not? Also, is it conservation landscaping or is it not? Is it cultivated or is it not? I know that this is kind of a multifaceted thing, so we're gonna kind of break it down right now. So, I want to start thinking about how this might look, on your day-to-day job, your process of trying to determine the difference between high grass and weeds and cultivated flowers and gardens, okay? So there's a few different ways that we're going to try to do that. I want us to be able to try to identify some common native plants, as well as some common invasive weeds, okay? If a property is full of invasive weeds, then you can be pretty sure that someone didn't plant them, right? On the other hand, if a property is full of native plants and you can recognize them, then you can tell that that's cultivated and they're not weeds. So, and again, there may still be an intervention needed, like an educational intervention needed on the part of the resident, on the part of the homeowner, but we're going to kind of get to that afterward. So we want to be able to identify some common native plants. And part of that means recognizing cultivated plants even when they're not in bloom. So I want you to recognize these two images, the one on this slide, and I'm going to go back to this slide, are actually the exact same space, same garden. You can see the pole in the middle right here. The plants are planted actually in a circle and there's cars parked behind them. In this image, it's really easy to tell that these are what I think are beautiful blooming plants. In this image, same circle, same pole, same cars parked behind. It's not as easy to tell. It looks kind of like a mess, but remember, that I said that we are also talking about, conservation-minded maintenance. So we're encouraging people to do this, to leave the dead stems and the seed heads throughout the winter and not clean them up until the spring. So I'm going to show you 11 different common native plant species. Of course, there are many, many more than that. This is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, but these are the most common. And I'm going to show you how they look throughout the seasons. And I want to encourage you to pay close attention because these species may come up later in our weed versus cultivated plant challenge, in which you are going to be competing against each other to see how many you can identify. So here are the first three. We've got black-eyed Susans. I'm going to turn on my laser pointer. We've got black-eyed Susans in the first column, coneflowers and sunflowers. And we see how these look in spring at the top, summer in the middle, and then fall and winter at the bottom. I wanted to point something out. I made these plural, black-eyed Susans, coneflowers with an S, sunflowers, because there are actually multiple species of each of these, which may look slightly different. I'm just kind of grouping them all together here for ease, but just something to keep in mind. So, when we see black-eyed Susans, most of us, I'm sure, can recognize that plant. It's Maryland's state flower. Everybody loves it. Same with, coneflowers and sunflowers, but they only look like that in the summer. In the spring, they look like, an increasingly tall plant, broad-leafed plant coming up out of the ground, might look kind of like a weed. So black-eyed Susans have kind of fuzzy and sort of rounded leaves. They do tend to plant themselves. I actually have black-eyed Susans coming up in the cracks in my back alley, which is why I'm not giving any of you my address. But they do tend to self-seed a little bit and spread. And so even though they're native, homeowners, residents still need to be able to kind of keep them in check in order to not do all the things that they're not supposed to do. Coneflowers leaves look kind of similar, but they're not as fuzzy, they're shinier. And then sunflowers have these kind of opposite leaves, so leaves that are directly across from each other. And you know, when you feel sunflower leaves and stems, they're also like kind of prickly to the touch. In the fall, they just sort of look like the very center of the flower with no petals. So you'll see them standing up various heights for different species, but you'll see them standing up in the late fall and winter, just kind of looking like a dried dead version of themselves. All right, so our next three are milkweeds, Joe Pye weeds, and goldenrods. Milkweeds, there's several different species. This one with the orange flowers is called butterfly weed. It's really small, it grows low to the ground. I would say, you know, less than a foot tall. Joe Pye weeds, on the other hand, you know, the straight species, there are dwarf cultivars, but the straight species of the most popular Joe Pye weed can get 6 feet tall. So a really common plant for feeding butterflies, but definitely not one that we tell people to plant up against the sidewalk because it will flop over and you know, obstruct the right of way. So in the fall, they get really fuzzy. Same with the milkweeds. They rely on the wind to blow their seeds around. And then the goldenrods in the spring, you know, they just kind of look like a tall weed, right? They just kind of look like a very narrow leafed plant growing up out of the soil. Lots of different species of goldenrod. So these 3 images are actually 3 different species, but some of them again get really tall. This one is called, the cultivar is called Fireworks. So it sends out these kind of shoots of flowers that eventually in the fall get yellow and attract lots of beneficial insects. All right, last one of these kind of common perennials. So we have our asters. They are fall bloomers, so they get, you know, a variety of colors of flowers, but a lot of times they're purple. They'll bloom in the fall. In the spring, they don't really look like much, just kind of a cluster of leaves. Phloxes are the opposite. They usually bloom in the spring. I say usually because sometimes they'll have like a second burst of flowers later in the summer or in the fall. You are probably seeing a lot of these outside right now. This species right here is called moss phlox or creeping phlox, and it tends to kind of like form a mat and sort of spill over the edges of things. It's a really common plant that is native. People like to plant phloxes right up against their sidewalks because they do stay pretty low, probably less than 4 inches. And so, you know, it's something that you might come across if it's growing right up against the sidewalk, and hopefully you'll be able to recognize it as a cultivated plant. And then, you know, this last category, grasses and sedges, so many different native species that could fall into this category. Some ways to tell the difference between these and just kind of overgrown turf grass, what's planted in people's yards, is a lot of times they'll grow in clumps. So you'll see the green, you know, kind of wispy, grassy blades starting to come up in a clump in the spring. These are, again, all 3 different species, but you can sort of see the clumps here. This, is this a grass or a sedge? I can't remember. It gets pretty tall. A lot of times people use these as kind of like a border or some kind of like barrier between, you know, one area of the garden and the next, or their own garden and their neighbor. In the winter, they look the same, just dried and brown. All right, and then I just have 2 native vines. So if you see these growing, hopefully you can recognize them as being cultivated, you know, most of the time, for the most part. So Virginia creeper, a lot of times people get a little freaked out because its leaves look very similar to poison ivy. Poison ivy also has leaflets, but poison ivy has 3 leaflets. That's why you hear the phrase leaves of 3, let it be, where Virginia creeper usually has 5. I say usually because depending on the leaf on the vine, there could be, you know, 4, but if you sort of look in the area, look at all the leaves, if there's more than 3, it's not poison ivy. This vine is deciduous, so it will lose its leaves in the winter. It will just look like a bare brown vine. And then coral honeysuckle is our only native honeysuckle species. So it has these really rounded green leaves. Some of them are kind of like attached to each other across the stem of the vine. And then they make these really beautiful long coral pink flowers. Sometimes they retain their leaves in the winter. So if you see them looking like this, and they also make berries, which is great for birds. So this image is actually a picture of my backyard, and I see, you know, mockingbirds and birds eating on the berries throughout the winter, which I think is pretty cool. Okay, so those are some of our most common native plant species. We also need to try to identify some common invasive weeds, which is not always easy. If you take a look at these two images on these slides, this is the same image that I just showed you of the native honeysuckle. This is the invasive Japanese honeysuckle. Okay, so it can be really difficult. It can be very challenging to tell the difference between some of these species. We're going to go through some common invasive plant species, but when we get finally to our cues to care, that's, I think, what's really going to help to distinguish between some of these hard to identify species. So these plants don't care about boundaries, so I'm going to pile them all on top of each other, just like they tend to do in a landscape, instead of keeping them in perfectly neat and tidy little rows like my native species. So this is Japanese honeysuckle. This is the one, I'm sorry to say, that has the little white flowers on it that you have probably, you know, pulled off and sucked on the sweet honey. I teach my students how to do it. It's, you know, a very cute thing to do. But this is an invasive vine, Japanese honeysuckle. This one is morning glory. Again, like a really popular plant. Some people might cultivate this plant, okay? And so in terms of the code, you know, this plant could be cultivated, and therefore, as long as it's not you know, abutting the sidewalk or the alley, it could, you know, be within code. That's not really for me to tell you, but I can tell you that this plant is invasive, and I wish that people wouldn't plant it. This plant is called bindweed. So it has a really similar looking flower to morning glory, but more of a kind of long, sort of sword shaped leaf. These leaves are really small. They look kind of big in this picture, but they're actually much smaller than the morning glory. The leaves are larger and more of a heart shape. And then finally, for our invasive vines, this one's called porcelain berry, and it has these clusters of berries that have a real like Willy Wonka, Dr. Seuss vibe to them. They're like all different kind of galactic looking colors, like purples and blues. And so this one has also been wrecking havoc on our spaces. You can see if you drive on 83 or any of the exit ramps off of 83, you can see it climbing up, you know, over the trees and everything. So this one's called porcelain berry. So those were invasive vines. These are some invasive ground covers. So this one is really popular. I'm sure you will see it if you are looking at just kind of an overgrown lawn. Canada thistle will tend to be there, and it's really spiky. If you've ever tried pulling it out of the ground, you know it's a huge nuisance. And then in the summer, it will get these kind of whitish, maybe a little bit purplish flowers. So that's a really common invasive ground cover. Nutsedge is another one. Tends to grow in wet areas, and it will kind of come up in these sort of clusters like this. And then it has these sort of clusters of seeds later in the summer. Very difficult to distinguish between our native sedges. This is a sedge, but this one is invasive. I'm battling this one in my yard right now. It's called chickweed. So you might see it kind of encroaching on a lawn, maybe even growing out like onto the sidewalk. If you see that, you know that that's a bad sign. And then finally, ragweed. Ragweed is the cause of all of your, well, maybe not all, but many, fall seasonal allergies. Everybody likes to blame goldenrod on it, but it's actually ragweed. So really distinct looking leaves with these deep lobes in them, and it can grow pretty tall and will bloom in the fall. All right, so ragweed, chickweed, nutsedge, and Canada thistle. All right, so, like I said, it's really difficult. None of us are going to have, an encyclopedic knowledge of all the plants that you might come across. So, the other signals that a plant is being cultivated really has nothing to do with the plant itself. It just has to do with, the surrounding area. So some other signals that you can look for. So for this, I would liken this to what I said earlier. I'm sure that there are signals that tell you if a space is neglected, those trash and rat holes and things. So cues to care are the opposite of that. All right, so these are things that tell you that it is a cultivated garden. These are other clues that let you know that. The reason I say finding the compromise between conservation landscaping and the code is because these are the kind of things that we try to teach people in order to make their kind of messy bird-friendly garden look a little more palatable. So I wanted to ask you another question, and you can put your answers into the chat about, what are some other things that you look at when you are deciding whether to give a property a citation? So, what are the kind of like clues that you use? I saw some images that Superintendent Yates sent to us where, there's a ruler, so you're actually measuring, but what are some other things that you look at when deciding whether to give a citation? So go ahead and put those into the chat. So I will start by pointing out that this rock wall and this fence are really good signals that this is a cultivated space. Even though the plants in between in this area look kind of messy, I can tell that it's cultivated because of these cues to care. So this rock wall and this fence kind of delineates the space in between that is a garden of cultivated plants. And then there's, a perfectly clear sidewalk on one side and a mowed lawn on the other side. I see some things coming into the chat, so keep putting those in there. I appreciate that. So, perhaps you can see the difference between these two gardens, both of which are cultivated. Both of these are gardens that were planted on purpose, and they both happen to be in the same yard. So they're cultivated by the same person. One of these gardens, the top one, it's pretty obvious, has cues to care, is what we call that. And the other one, the one on the bottom, does not. So I wanted to tell you more about cues to care because these are some other kind of signals that you can look for. If you can't, identify the plant species, these might help you tell whether a space is cultivated or whether it's just overgrown, high grass and weeds. So cues to care is actually a term that was coined in 1995 in a paper titled Messy Ecosystems, Orderly Frames. So it describes actions taken by humans that indicate that a landscape is well cared for and meets the cultural expectations of standards for maintenance. So, when finding the compromise between conservation landscaping and the code, that may just mean adding some proper framing on the part of the resident, right? So these are things that you can look for, but these are not things for you to actually do. These are things for the resident to do. I just like that, that title of that paper, Messy Ecosystems, Orderly Frames. So even if the garden itself is messy, if we add these orderly frames, it can help to indicate to neighbors and others that it's on purpose, that it's cultivated. So one of the best, cues to care that somebody can do is they can plant for 4 seasons of visual interest. So there's no season in which everything looks dead and abandoned or overgrown and abandoned. So, this is a spring blooming flower, a summer blooming flower, a fall blooming flower, and then even some visual interest with some, colorful berries in the winter. Having these overlapping sequence of blooms and visual interest can tell you and others that the space is purposeful. They can mow the edges that abut the sidewalks, gutters, and alleys, right? So keeping that edge to 4 inches to keep it within code. I think that's a really easy way to find a compromise. Or mulching those edges, right? So, we have the layers of native plants planted back here, but there's an edge of mulch which sort of separates it from, the rest of the landscape or from the sidewalk or whatever the case may be, and tells others that it's on purpose. They can prune their trees and shrubs in order to keep a line of sight to the home's windows and doors and not obstruct any public property like the street or the sidewalk. So intentional pruning is important. And they can add structures like fences or like the terraced beds in this image, or like the raised bed here. So this is something that a lot of folks actually tend to do in order to separate kind of their lawn space from their habitat garden space, is to contain it in a raised bed. And then, of course, adding a habitat sign always helps as well. That hopefully sparks that conversation with neighbors about, why your garden might look a little bit messier than is sort of the traditional aesthetic. Okay, definitely let me know. We're going to go through each of the pairs of photos that you all just looked at, and let me know about your discussion. We're at 4:18. We're supposed to end at 4:30. So we'll try to go quickly. So in this pair, Susie, which option did your team decide was the cultivated garden?
A.
Okay. My group also said A, so we both get a point. So this is, a winter garden, but hopefully you recognize the dead cone flowers here. There's actually some new growth coming. Hopefully you can see where I'm pointing, but here we go. You can see some new growth coming up from the garden, from the ground. And maybe the most obvious sign is the habitat signs right here. Any discussion on this one that we should pause on? I thought this one was pretty straightforward.
Yeah, this one was clear cut.
All right, so A was the right answer. On to our second pair. So which one did you, your group think was cultivated?
We said B.
All right, we also said B, and that is correct. Ding, ding, ding. So this garden has layers. It also has this fence. That's a cue to care. I'm not saying that the image on the left is a violation. I can't actually see the edge of the sidewalk or anything like obstructing the path. And, clearly there's some mowed grass here. So somebody is doing some kind of care for this garden. But these plants back here are weeds. This is just like an overgrown flower bed. Any discussion we have to have about that? Okay.
No.
Next pair, this one I know is a little bit trickier. Susie, which one did your group think was the cultivated image?
So most said A, but a couple said both.
Okay. Our group also said A, and that is the correct one. And I told my group that this image is a little trickier because it requires you to recognize some of the species that we talked about. So this is an aster over here. This is a shade-loving aster on this side, which is a native plant. So this is actually a property that has their bird-friendly habitat sign. In this picture, this plant right here is Canada thistle. I see a few of them actually, and maybe even some ragweed. I know it can be difficult to tell in some of the images, but this is just an overgrown patch of yard, not cultivated.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's one where, you know, I'm not saying necessarily that this is a code violation because there is kind of an edge here. But if you can start to recognize the species, you can see that it's, they're weeds. It's not being cared for. What did your group think about this one, Susie?
They thought B.
Oh, I forgot to keep track of our points again. Okay, yes, my group also thought B, which is correct. So we can see the native honeysuckle here. We can see this phlox back here. Phlox a lot of time is a plant that you'll see growing in the shade. Not all the time, but there's tulips in here. These plants down here don't have flowers yet, but this is black-eyed Susans. So you might recognize those kind of smaller, kind of rounded leaves. Both of them have a fence, but this one, you know, the weeds are growing outside the fence, definitely not on purpose. We feel okay about that one?
Yeah, the only comment I would share is that there were some sort of, we were quick to react to say that B was the one because there were flowers in bloom. And a catch-22, right? That it's not necessarily a beneficial flower that's in bloom. It could be, you know, ecologically destructive, versus they're also beneficial plants that aren't always in bloom. So recognizing them is helpful.
Yep.
I thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah. Okay. Number 5.
So there, some said B, some said both were cultivated.
Some said B, some said both. Okay. So the answer is B. And I can tell when I look at this because there are black-eyed Susans here. There are cone flowers right here. These are goldenrod, but they haven't bloomed yet. This side, I'm not even sure if I can identify these plants, but it maybe looks like morning glory or maybe even English ivy, both of which are invasive. They're just kind of growing along the ground.
Yeah.
So the one on
take over.
Mm-hmm.
It's to me, it's a sign of neglect that the invasives have taken over. Yeah.
Right.
So you don't see people that, some people prefer to have like the ivy in their yard so that they don't have to do the mowing and they want it there. And typically, I can't speak for everyone else, but you know, it's allowed.
Yeah, I mean, so from your perspective, if it's not, you know, in violation of the code and it's a cultivated plant, then, you know, that seems like that's allowed. You know, from our perspective, English ivy, yes, it's a very popular ornamental plant. It's really invasive. So we know that it's a non-native plant, but we also know that it's very common ornamental. People will plant it on purpose.
Yeah, they will do it on purpose. So you guys are discouraging anyone to kind of have anything that.
I didn't hear your question kind of trailed off.
I'm sorry, for some reason my Zoom always doesn't pick up my microphone. So the plants that you're discouraging, the plants that are invasive.
Exactly. Yes. But when it comes to your job and whether or not to give a citation, as long as they're not, you know, violating the code, then, you know, that's your expertise. I think you do have a list of like noxious weeds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think English ivy is included on that. It's a really popular ornamental plant. You can buy it at Home Depot, along with lots of other invasive plants.
Right.
So yeah, that's kind of more like your expertise in making that decision. Like from a conservation standpoint, we can say that's not a good plant to have, but we're not giving anybody citations. I hope
So
that makes sense.
what about the height? That some plants can get like very like 6 feet. Is there something that they should cut back or just let it grow? Because if they cut it, will it die? I don't know what kind of plants they are, but I've seen them.
So, my understanding just, from the perspective of the code is that as long as it's a cultivated plant, meaning it's planted on purpose and it's not, abutting the sidewalk or gutters or alleys, that it's allowed.
Okay.
I believe the code says 8 inches. So, if it's not abutting the sidewalk and it's less than 8 inches, it's okay. If it's more than 8 inches, it's okay if it's cultivated. So that's what we're trying to distinguish between.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. It's 4:27, so I'm going to kind of zoom through the rest of these, and then I figure if anyone has any more questions and wants to keep going, we are happy to stay on and discuss those. This one's really tricky, Susie. Which did your group think?
They thought A. Wasn't
So did ours, which is correct. Yeah, someone even correctly identified it in my group. So on the left is goldenrod. That's how it looks when it blooms. And on the right is the invasive nutsedge. I'm going to keep rocking and rolling. So this is number 7. What did your group think, Susie?
So we had some for A, but we had some for both, thinking that it was planted on purpose. You can see pathways in both that imply it's intentional.
Okay.
Debate on this one.
Okay, so I mean, of the two, I think there's a lot of cues to care going along in the image on the left. There are these paths here. You can see the different layers of vegetation. There's lower planted plants toward next to the path, higher, taller plants towards the back. On this side, it looks like there's almost like an urban farm going on here. And then there's just sort of like a fallow area where it's not being maintained. This is just like grass that's, overgrown. There's no layers. There's no kind of intention to this space. So for that reason, the one on the left is cultivated. I'm not an urban farmer. Perhaps there is a purpose to letting the plants grow like this, but it doesn't at least appear intentional. All right, 3 more. What did your group think about this one, Susie?
They said A, and I think they said $50 for letter B. That came up.
Yes, yeah, I heard a lot of that too. And someone remembered that this is a picture from my yard. And once again, I told them that I'm not going to give them my address, but this is the native honeysuckle, the coral honeysuckle. The one on the right is the invasive Japanese honeysuckle, and also just, cues to care, like the opposite of cues to care going on here. There's, trash, it's growing into the alley. There's, fallen trees and all of that. So the one on the left is cultivated. Second to last one. What did your group think, Susie?
So we didn't get this far.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I can just discuss these since it's right at 4:30. So in this scenario, the image on the right is the cultivated garden. But I can see here that there might be some issues with the plants that are growing right up against the sidewalk. This is a homeowner who has their Audubon sign, and I think this is a really interesting case study because her neighbor across the street actually threatened to call and report her yard because of all of the, nuisance birds or things that were coming over to her neighbor. And so she got in touch with us, and that's when, I first started kind of really looking and thinking about the code. And so what I might advise her to do is, put in some of those cues to care, put in some of those orderly frames. And then there's really, these plants are cultivated. She is caring for them and planting them on purpose. You can see a bird bath. There's lawn decorations. So as long as she, makes sure that she's not abutting the sidewalk, then she should be fine. This is the last one. And in this case, the one on the left, my PowerPoint is frozen. There we go. The one on the left is the cultivated garden. This is actually somebody's front yard. So like, that's kind of wild to think about. Definitely not your traditional aesthetic that we think of in like the, you know, American yard, but there's a path here. These, you know, plants are more or less growing in clumps. This image on the right is just an overgrown yard. And there's some other, you know, cues here. Trash and fallen limbs and things tell me that this is maybe not being cared for. So, you know, that's, we won't say who won. I'm really, really glad. I'm actually really excited that you had lots of good conversation. I hope that you all found it really valuable. If you have more questions and want to discuss some of the issues that you talked about in your groups or other challenges that you're having and some solutions that you think that would be helpful or some resources that you might need, let us know. The last thing that I will tell you is, again, you know, we're trying to raise awareness about this on both sides. And so something else that we're producing in addition to these trainings for you all is some kind of notice or informational pamphlet that you can actually leave with homeowners, either like in lieu of a citation or along with sort of a citation warning. So these would be things to help that homeowner kind of make adjustment, add those orderly frames to their garden in order to, you know, avoid the citation, but still making sure that they are planting bird-friendly garden, habitat garden in the right way, you know, so they're not just letting it go. They're not just pulling an Elsa. We want to be able to teach them as well how to, you know, use native plants, use conservation-minded maintenance, all of those things, while making sure that our neighborhoods are still beautiful and look cared for. You know, nobody's trying to upset their neighbors or anything like that. So I know that this went really fast. I hope that you got something out of it. And yeah, I'd be happy to hear any further questions or discussion. But it is past 4:30 at this point, so I really appreciate you all. And I'll just say before you leave, thanks so much for being here and for this great new partnership.
Thank you, Erin and Susan, for actually giving us this information to help us do our job every day. So I just want to thank you all for even doing this presentation for us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for helping us to develop it as well.
You're welcome. Well, if no one have any questions, I just want to thank you all for attending this presentation or this training. And I hope you all found it interesting as well as informative for you all to do your job every day. So again, thank you. And if you have any questions beyond this presentation, definitely give me you could email me and I could go back to Susan and Erin if it's something that they have to explain or they should explain further.